"Stop looking at her," someone whispered, but the hall had already made its choice. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, with silver banners hanging from the rafters and 100 nobles seated in polished silence, Luna Ilara Vale stood alone at the center of the moonstone court. Her pale blue gown was simple by royal standards, her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white, and yet she held her head high as if dignity were a crown no one could take from her. Across from her, King Cashinvare, the Alpha King, did not look at the woman who had stood beside him for 3 years. He looked past her, past the fragile hope in her eyes, and let his voice fall like winter over the room. "Ilara Vale is no longer my Luna." The words did not thunder. They did not need to. They landed with a colder weight than any shout could carry, and for one stunned heartbeat, the entire court forgot how to breathe. Ilara felt the blood leave her face. Not because she had not feared this moment. She had. Every quiet dismissal, every measured silence, every time he had chosen duty over tenderness had been leading her here. Still, hearing it spoken aloud in front of the pack made something deep inside her go still, as if her heart had stepped back from the edge to keep from breaking in public. A few nobles exchanged glances. A few hid their smiles too late. One woman near the front lifted her chin in obvious satisfaction, as though this had been a prize she had waited to see handed out. Ilara kept her eyes on the polished floor, on the reflection of torchlight trembling beneath her feet, because if she looked at Cashin now, she was afraid she would see pity. Or worse, nothing at all. But Cashin's expression was unreadable, carved from the same hard resolve that had made him legendary across every pack border. He was the kind of ruler people obeyed before he raised his voice, the kind of man whose silence could empty a room. Tonight, that silence felt personal. One of the elders cleared his throat and stepped forward, eager to turn humiliation into ceremony. "By royal decree, the title of Luna will be removed, and a new path will be chosen for the realm." His words blurred in Ilara's ears. New path. Chosen. Removed. As if a woman could be set aside like a ceremonial cloak no longer in season. Ilara's fingers loosened one by one. She had spent years learning how to stand still when every instinct told her to run. She had learned how to smile when she was overlooked, how to bow when she was dismissed, how to make herself smaller in rooms built for larger personalities. But this was the final lesson. When Cashin finally turned his head, his gaze met hers for the briefest moment, and she saw nothing soft there. No regret. No warning. Just the cold certainty of a king who believed the world would continue turning after he broke a heart in front of witness and candlelight. "Ilara Vale," he said, each syllable clean and controlled, "your place at my side is ended." A murmur swept through the court like a draft under a locked door. Ilara inhaled slowly. Once. Twice. The air tasted of wax, perfume, and the sweet sting of embarrassment she refused to let show. Then she lifted her chin, and for the first time that night, her voice came out steady. "Then I will leave with my dignity intact." The room went still again. Cashin's eyes sharpened, as if he had not expected her to speak that way. No tears. No pleading. No collapse. Just a woman standing in the ashes of a public rejection and refusing to kneel. Somewhere outside the high windows, a bell began to ring in the distance, soft and almost mournful, as though the kingdom itself had heard the moment and chosen to remember it. Ilara felt the weight of every gaze in the hall, but she did not flinch. Not when the whispers began. Not when the silence after them grew heavier than before. Because something had changed in her, something no one in that room could see yet. And as she took one step back from the throne, the moonlight spilling through the tall glass behind her seemed to gather around her shoulders like a promise long delayed. Ilara did not realize how far she had walked until the music from the court faded behind her and the cold night air touched her cheeks. The palace corridor stretched ahead in silver shadows, lined with lanterns that burned low and steady, as if even the flame had learned how to keep its distance from a woman who had just been cast aside. Her pulse was still too loud in her ears. Each measured step felt heavier than the last, not because she was weak, but because humiliation had a way of settling into the body like winter frost, thin and invisible until it reached the bones. She kept her back straight anyway. That was the one thing Cashin could not take from her. Not with his cold gaze. Not with his careful words. Not with the way the entire court had watched in silence as if her pain were a spectacle they had paid to see. At the end of the corridor, the wide balcony doors stood open to the moonlit gardens. Elara stepped through them and drew in a breath that tasted like rain and stone and distant pine. The night air did not soothe her, but it steadied her. Below, the palace grounds spread out in pale silver lines, hedges trimmed into impossible symmetry, fountains glinting like broken glass under the moon. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the strange emptiness that had opened inside her when Cashin called her name and then dismissed her like an inconvenience. She had loved him for years. She had endured the court for years. She had mistaken patience for loyalty, silence for grace, and duty for something close to affection. Tonight had stripped all of that bare. A soft sound came from behind her, the faint scrape of boots against stone. Elara turned, expecting a servant, perhaps a guard. Instead, she saw one of the lesser council men lingering near the doorway, his expression sharp with the kind of curiosity that always followed scandal. He looked at her with the same pitying amusement everyone else had worn tonight. "You should leave before the rest of the court starts talking," he said. "They will talk either way," Elara answered, her voice quiet but even. He gave a thin smile, as though he had been waiting for her to break. "Then at least do not give them a reason to remember you." The insult landed cleanly, though he had tried to dress it as advice. Elara felt it, but she refused to let it bend her. "I think," she said, lifting her chin toward the moon above the garden, "they will remember me whether I ask them to or not." The man blinked, startled by the calm in her tone. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his gaze flicked past her shoulder, toward the dark edge of the terrace. Something there had drawn his attention. Elara felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, faint and electric, like the hush that falls before a storm reaches the roof. The lanterns along the balcony flickered once. Then again. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf called out, low and solemn, and the sound rolled through the garden like a warning no one understood yet. The councilman stiffened. Elara followed his line of sight, her breath catching as a figure emerged from the darkness at the far end of the terrace. He moved slowly, one hand braced against the stone wall, his shoulders tense beneath a dark traveling cloak dusted with night and road. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and clearly injured, though he carried himself with a stubborn kind of control that suggested pain was only an inconvenience to be mastered. A fresh cut marked the side of his jaw. There was dirt at the hem of his cloak. His face was half-shadowed, but not enough to hide the intensity of his eyes when they lifted and met hers. Elara felt the world narrow. Not because he was beautiful, though he was. Not because he was dangerous, though something in him certainly was. It was the stillness around him. The kind of stillness that belonged to power held carefully in check. "You cannot be here," the councilman snapped, taking a step forward. "This terrace is closed to visitors." The stranger did not even glance at him. His attention remained fixed on Elara as if the two of them were alone in all the kingdom. "You are bleeding," she said before she could stop herself. The words surprised even her. He looked down as if only now noticing the dark stain across his sleeve. Then, with an expression so unreadable it made her pulse quicken, he said, "It is not my blood." The councilman scoffed. "Who are you supposed to be?" The stranger finally turned his head, and when he did, the moonlight caught the hard line of his face and the scar near his brow. There was something familiar in him, something that tugged at memory without offering an answer. But before Elara could think further, the stranger's knees gave a slight, almost invisible falter. Only for an instant. Only enough for her to see the strain he had been hiding. Without meaning to, she stepped forward. The councilman reached out as if to stop her, but Elara had already moved. "Do not touch him," she said softly. It was not a command meant for him alone. The stranger's eyes settled on her again, and this time the expression there changed, just slightly, as if he had not expected anyone to notice the strain beneath his silence. Elara looked at the blood on his sleeve, the controlled tension in his jaw, the way he stood as if he had walked too far on too little strength. Something in her old instinct awakened, the one that had once urged her to care for broken things long before she learned how to protect her own heart. "Come inside," she said. "At least until you can stand without shaking." The councilman stared at her as if she had lost her mind. The stranger, however, did not move. He only watched her with those unreadable eyes, and in the moonlit stillness between them, Elara had the strange sensation that she was being measured not by rank, not by beauty, and not by the wand she carried from the court, but by something deeper and far more dangerous, the honesty of her choice. Elara held the little vial in both hands as if it might vanish if she breathed too hard. The stranger had taken the seat across from her in the quietest corner of the palace healing room, where the moonlight came through narrow windows and turned everything to silver. He had said his name was Rowan, though something in the steadiness of his gaze made the name feel incomplete, like a door left half open. "You are looking at that as if it is a precious jewel," he said, his voice low and dry with exhaustion. Elara lowered her eyes to the vial again. It was only a simple salve, made from dried herb powder, warmed oil, and the last of her honey stock. Nothing grand. Nothing fit for the court. But her hands had not stopped trembling since the councilman had sneered at her in the corridor, and this small task gave those hands a purpose. "It is the only thing I have that works quickly," she said. "And you should not be walking around with a wand like that." A faint pause followed. Then, to her surprise, his mouth curved at one corner, almost a smile. "You noticed my wound before you noticed my rank." Elara looked up, uncertain how to answer that. In the palace, rank was everything. Rank decided who bowed and who was ignored, who was invited and who was left standing in a corridor like a shadow that had outlived its welcome. Yet when she met Rowan's eyes, she saw none of the usual hunger for power, none of the polished cruelty she had just left behind in the hall. He seemed less interested in being admired than in seeing whether she meant what she said. That unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Outside the room, footsteps passed and faded. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of crushed herbs and raindamp stone. Elara set the vial down, dipped her fingers into the balm, and reached for his sleeve. He did not pull away, but she felt the tension in him anyway, a quiet resistance that had nothing to do with pain. His arm was warm beneath her touch, warmer than she expected, and the fabric of his coat was damp at the edge where the blood had dried dark against the cuff. She cleaned the wound carefully, aware of every small movement, every shallow breath he took when her fingers brushed too close. "You are very calm for someone being tended by a stranger," she said softly. "I have learned that calm is useful," Rowan replied. "People are less likely to ask the wrong questions." The words settled between them like dust in a beam of light. Elara glanced at him, but he was looking at the bandage now, not at her, his expression unreadable again. She wondered what questions he had spent his life avoiding. She wondered why a man with his kind of posture carried himself like someone who had been hunted by expectations. When she finished wrapping the cloth, her fingertips lingered for one brief moment against his wrist. She felt a pulse there, steady and strong beneath the skin, and something in her chest eased without permission. "There," she said, drawing her hand back. "You should be able to move without making it worse." Rowan flexed his fingers once, testing the support. "And if I thank you, will you refuse to accept it?" Elara almost laughed, though the sound came out smaller than she intended. "No," she said. "I am not cruel." For the first time, his expression shifted into something softer, something almost astonished. It was as if he had expected suspicion, not kindness. As if he had spent so long among people who measured worth by titles that her simple answer had become an unexpected form of courage. Elara looked down, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt under his attention. Not because he had touched her, but because he had noticed her. Truly noticed her. The palace had not done that in years. It had looked through her, over her, sometimes directly at her, and still found a way to see nothing useful. Yet Rowan watched her as though the small bowl of balm in her hands mattered as much as any crown. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and impatient. Ilara stiffened. Rowan did not. He only lifted his head slightly, his body going still in a way that suggested he had heard many doors open on danger. The knock came again, louder this time. "Lady Ilara," a voice called from beyond the wood. "The hall is asking for you." Ilara closed her fingers around the edge of the bowl. The request was polite enough, but she heard the warning underneath it. The hall. The people who had laughed. The people who had watched her leave with pity or satisfaction, or both. She should not return. Every instinct in her body told her that. Yet before she could answer, Rowan spoke from his chair, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. "If you go back there now, they will expect you to shrink." Ilara turned toward him. "And what if I do not?" His gaze held hers without blinking. "Then they will begin to learn who you are." The words struck deeper than the councilman's insult ever could. Ilara stood very still. For a moment, she could not tell whether she was afraid of the hall behind the door or of the strange, impossible hope rising inside her at the sound of his voice. Ilara had barely lifted her hand from the bowl when the palace doors opened again, and the quiet in the healing room changed at once. It was not the sound itself that made her turn. It was the way the air seemed to tighten around the threshold, as if the palace itself had recognized someone important long before she did. A pair of guards stepped aside. A lord in dark green silks entered first, his face drawn into a careful mask of concern. Behind him came two attendants carrying a velvet case and a folded cloak trimmed in silver thread. Ilara's fingers curled against the bowl. Rowan did not move. He only watched, his posture still relaxed, though she had begun to notice that his stillness was never truly idle. It was the stillness of a man who missed nothing. The Lord gave her a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Lady Ilara," he said, as if her name belonged to a person he had already decided was inconvenient, "the court has been informed that you were withdrawn from the celebration without proper notice. Their curiosity has become difficult to manage." Ilara felt the heat rise in her chest, not from anger exactly, but from the old, familiar shame of being spoken about as though she were a problem to be explained. "I did not ask to be discussed," she said softly. The Lord looked past her to the vial in her hands. "And yet you were seen leaving with the king's healing house in hand." That small phrase, delivered with polished politeness, struck like a challenge. Rowan's gaze shifted to the Lord, then back to Ilara, as though he were waiting to see what she would do with the moment. The attendants opened the velvet case. Inside lay a silver circlet set with moonstone, delicate enough to look ceremonial, expensive enough to feel like a warning. "His Majesty has requested that you return to the hall," the Lord said. "The matter of your place at court must be clarified before the entire gathering." Ilara almost laughed, though nothing about the situation was funny. Clarified. The word sounded clean. It sounded merciful. It was neither. It meant she would be placed back under every gaze that had already judged her. It meant she would be asked to stand where she had been made small and pretend not to remember. The room seemed to close in around her. She thought of the whispers, of the lifted chins, of the exact second the court had decided she was unworthy of grace. Her throat tightened. For one unsteady breath, she considered refusing. Then Rowan stood. Not quickly. Not with drama. He rose as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than the room, and the simple motion drew every eye toward him. The Lord's expression changed first. It was slight, but Ilara saw it, the careful politeness faltered, and underneath it came a flicker of unease. Rowan took the folded cloak from the attendant's hands and held it out toward Ilara, not touching her, only offering. "If you return," he said, his voice quiet, "do not go back as the woman they expected to dismiss." Ilara looked at the cloak. Moonlight caught in its silver thread and made it seem almost alive. "And what woman should I be?" she asked. His answer came after the smallest pause, as though the truth mattered enough to be measured. "The one who chooses her own place in the room." The words settled over her like warmth. Not command. Not pity. Choice. She had not realized how starved she was for that one thing until it was offered without condition. The Lord cleared his throat. "There is no time for riddles," he said, though now his voice had lost its smoothness. "The hall is waiting." Rowan turned his head just enough to look at him. "Then they can wait a little longer." The Lord blinked, taken aback, and for the first time Alara noticed that no one in the room seemed certain of where to place Rowan in the hierarchy of the palace. That uncertainty rippled through the attendants. One lowered his eyes. The other shifted the velvet case closer to his chest. Alara saw it then. Something in Rowan's bearing made people hesitate, not because he demanded it, but because they felt it. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to name his authority. It surrounded him the way a storm surrounds the horizon before it arrives. She drew a slow breath. The cloak felt heavy in her hands when she accepted it, heavier than fabric should have felt, as though with it she was accepting a threshold she could not cross back over once chosen. Her injured wrist throbbed beneath the sleeve, reminding her of how fragile she had felt only moments before. Yet when she looked up, the fear that had ruled her all evening no longer seemed as large. "If I go," she said, mostly to herself, "they will stare." Rowan's mouth softened, almost into a smile. "Let them." Alara lifted her chin. That tiny motion changed the room more than any decree could have. The Lord studied her with the look of a man who had expected her to fold and was now forced to recalculate. "Very well," he said at last, though the words sounded less like permission than retreat. "Follow me." But Alara did not move immediately. She looked at the cloak in her hands, then at Rowan. There was something in his eyes now that she could not name, something steady and deeply watchful, as if he were not merely escorting her back to the hall but preparing her for a moment that would alter more than her standing among these people. "Why are you helping me?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question hung there, raw and honest. For an instant, the room was so still she could hear the faint crackle of the hearth. Rowan's gaze did not waver. "Because," he said, "I have seen what they do when they think no one is watching." Ilara's breath caught. Something in the answer did not fully fit the man before her, and that only deepened the strange pull of him. He had spoken like someone who knew the court from the inside, like someone who had already decided that her humiliation mattered. Outside the door, the hall waited. Inside the room, the silence between them grew charged and delicate, full of things neither of them had named. Alara closed her fingers around the cloak and felt, for the first time in a long while, that stepping forward might not mean surrender. It might mean being seen. And as she took the first step toward the door, Rowan fell into pace beside her, not ahead of her, not behind her, but exactly where he could guard her every breath. The corridor beyond the healing room was colder than the chamber behind it, and Alara felt that cold settle in her bones as Rowan guided her forward at an unhurried pace. The palace had changed around them. Or perhaps it was only her that had changed, because the same polished floors, the same golden torchlight, and the same hush of servants parting at the walls no longer felt like a place built to crush her. It felt like a place holding its breath. Alara kept her chin level, though every step still carried the echo of the councilman's contempt, the sharpness of the court's laughter, and the memory of standing alone beneath 1,000 judging eyes. She thought Rowan would speak, would explain himself, would answer the questions stacking in her mind like stones. But he said nothing. He only walked beside her, steady as a shadow, his presence so calm it was almost impossible to believe he had entered her life only moments ago. At the next turn, they passed a row of arched windows washed in moonlight. Alara caught her reflection in the glass and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her hair had loosened. Her sleeves were still marked by the healing salve. Her face was tired, yes, but there was something else now. A look in her eyes she had not seen in years. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile for what she carried. This was something leaner, sharper, more dangerous. The knowledge that she had stepped out of the court alive, and not because she had begged for mercy. They reached a side passage lined with carved stone wolves, their noses lifted as though they were listening. Rowan slowed there, and at last he spoke. You should not return to the main hall tonight. Elara glanced up at him. And if I do not return, what will they think? The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. That you chose yourself. The answer startled her more than any insult had. She looked away, gripping the little vial in her pocket until its glass pressed against her palm. I do not know how to do that, she said quietly. Rowan stopped walking. The silence around them deepened, as if even the torches had leaned closer. Then learn, he said. There is nothing shameful in beginning there. Elara stared at him, searching his face for mockery and finding none. That was the hardest thing of all. Not the kindness itself, but the fact that it seemed genuine. It unsettled her in a way cruelty never had. Cruelty was familiar. Cruelty followed rules. This did not. They turned into a narrow gallery where the ceiling opened above them into a high glass dome. Moonlight poured down in silver sheets, touching the floor, the walls, and the old statues standing watch at the corners. Elara slowed without meaning to. The sight was so quiet, so beautiful, that it made her chest ache. Rowan noticed at once. He followed her gaze upward, then back to her. My mother used to bring me here, he said, and the softness in his voice changed the shape of the room. She said the moon made honest things of us when the world would not. Elara did not know why those words caught her so deeply. Perhaps because no one had ever spoken to her as though honesty were a strength instead of a flaw. Perhaps because in that silver light, the lonely parts of her felt less like burdens and more like pieces waiting to be understood. She turned her head slightly. Was she loved here? Rowan was quiet for a moment too long. When he answered, his voice was low and careful. Not enough. The simple truth of it lingered between them. Elara felt the ache of it, though she could not have explained why. The answer did not sound like something learned from rumor. It sounded like memory. Like grief. She studied him more closely then, noticing the way his hands stayed still at his sides, the way his gaze kept moving toward the shadows at the end of the gallery as though he were listening for something that did not belong to either of them. Who are you? She asked before she could stop herself. It was not the first time she had wondered, but now the question carried more weight. Rowan did not look away. Someone who is running out of patience with what this palace has done to decent people, he said. It was not an answer, and yet it was somehow too honest to dismiss. Elara's heart thudded once, hard and uncertain. She had met polished men at court who offered entire speeches and said nothing at all. Rowan gave her half a sentence and somehow it felt truer than all of them. From somewhere farther down the corridor, a bell sounded softly, signaling the hour. Elara should have felt urgency then, the pressure to obey, to retreat, to disappear as she had always been taught. Instead, she stood in the moonlit gallery with her fingers still wrapped around the vial in her pocket and felt something else take root in the quiet. Not safety. Not yet. But possibility. Rowan extended his hand, not touching her, only offering it. The gesture was so small that no one else in the palace would have understood its weight. To Elara, it felt like a door opening in a house she had believed was all walls. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and for a brief, breathless moment, the entire palace seemed to recede behind the hush of the moon. When she placed her hand in his, it was not surrender. It was the first honest choice she had made in years. By the time Elara reached the upper gallery, the palace had gone quiet in that uneasy way it only did when power was shifting hands. Servants lowered their eyes as she passed. Courtiers who had once looked through her now looked away too quickly, as if even a glance might betray what they were thinking. Elara kept her hand wrapped around the small vial in her pocket, feeling its cool weight against her fingers, a reminder that something real had been placed in her care. Something no one had taken from her yet. Rowan walked beside her without crowding her, his presence steady and unreadable, like a wall of winter light. He did not ask her to speak. He did not offer comfort she had not earned. He simply stayed close enough for her to feel that she was no longer moving alone. They turned a corner into a long corridor lined with tall windows, and moonlight spilled across the marble floor in pale strips. Elara slowed before she realized she was doing it. The night beyond the glass looked endless, silver and still, and for one breathless second she imagined herself standing somewhere beyond all of this, beyond the court, beyond the whispers, beyond the life that had taught her to lower her head. The thought was so dangerous it almost frightened her. Rowan noticed. Of course he did. You are thinking too loudly, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Elara glanced at him, startled by the faintest trace of dry humor in his tone. It should have made her bristle. Instead, it loosened something in her chest. I did not know that was possible, she said quietly. For you, perhaps it is not. His answer was so calm, so immediate, that she almost smiled before she caught herself. Almost. The sound of distant footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and both of them paused. A pair of attendants appeared at the far archway, carrying folded linens and silver trays, their expressions carefully blank. They saw Elara, saw Rowan beside her, and their pace faltered for the briefest moment before they bowed and moved on. The hesitation was enough to tell her that the palace had already noticed the difference. Not everyone had seen her this way before. Not everyone would approve. Yet the old ache in her stomach, the one that usually came before humiliation, did not rise. Instead, she felt a strange and fragile steadiness. Rowan looked ahead, then back to her. If you want to turn around, do it now, he said. No one will call it weakness. The offer struck her harder than she expected. Not because it was grand, but because it was not. He was not pushing her forward. He was giving her a choice and meaning it. Elara stared at the dark corridor ahead, then at the door at its end, half hidden beneath the glow of a lantern. Behind that door waited the council, the whispers, and every careful face that had learned how to make her feel small. But for the first time, those things no longer felt like a cage that had already closed. They felt like a room she might enter on her own terms. Her fingers tightened around the vial. She thought of the stranger in the healing room, of the quiet kindness in his eyes, of the way he had spoken to her as if her voice mattered. She thought of all the years she had mistaken silence for safety. Then she lifted her chin. I am not turning back, she said. Rowan studied her for a long moment, and something like approval passed through his expression, brief and guarded, but real. He extended his hand again, not as a command, not even as a promise, only as an invitation. This time Elara did not hesitate. When her fingers touched his, the contact was light, almost careful, yet it carried more weight than anything that had happened in the court all evening. It was not the touch of a man claiming obedience. It was the touch of someone making room. Together they walked toward the lantern door, the moon at their backs and the future waiting ahead, and Elara felt, with rising certainty, that whatever happened next would not be decided for her. The lantern door opened onto a chamber so still it felt untouched by time. Elara stepped inside with Rowan at her side, and the first thing she noticed was the light. It did not fall from chandeliers or glass windows, but from a tall row of moonlit panels that turned the polished floor silver and made every face in the room look sharper, older, more dangerous. Courtiers stood in careful clusters along the walls, their voices lowered to brittle whispers. At the far end of the chamber, beneath a carved arch of pale stone, a woman in deep blue had already turned to face them, her expression composed in the way of people who had long ago learned how to hide their fear behind discipline. Your Highness, she said, bowing to Rowan with formal precision. Then her gaze slid to Elara, paused, and softened by only a fraction. And you must be the healer they have all been talking about. Elara felt the room narrow around her. She kept one hand closed around the vial in her pocket, its cool shape steadying her more than she would have admitted aloud. Rowan did not speak for her. He simply stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, silent enough that she understood the choice he was making. He was leaving the moment in her hands. The woman in blue took one measured step forward. "I am Lady Isolde," she said. "Keeper of the royal records and sworn advisor to the throne. If you have been brought here, then there is a reason." Elara lifted her chin. She could feel the attention of the entire chamber pressing gently, insistently, like a hand against glass. "I did not ask to come," she said, and her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "But I was told there was something I needed to see." A few of the courtiers exchanged glances. The woman in blue inclined her head as if that answer pleased her. "Then you are already wiser than most who arrive here." She gestured to the table at the center of the chamber, where an open ledger waited beneath a lamp. Its pages were lined with neat columns, names, dates, and seals. Elara stared at it, unsure why the sight of ink on paper made the air in her lungs feel suddenly thin. Rowan noticed. He always noticed. "Read the lower line," he said quietly. Elara moved closer. The writing was old, but the script was clear enough. She traced the row with her eyes, moving past names she did not recognize until one caught and held her still. Her own. Not the name she had been called in the servants' wing. Not the one spoken with pity, or with dismissal, or not spoken at all. Her true name, written in the royal ledger beside a mark she had never seen before. Her breath caught. "That cannot be right," she whispered. Lady Isolde did not answer immediately. She only watched Elara with a careful, almost sorrowful patience. "It was recorded before you were old enough to remember," she said. "There was a reason it was hidden." Elara looked up, and for one disorienting moment the chamber seemed to tilt. Hidden. The word landed in her chest like something long buried finally stirring awake. She turned to Rowan, searching his face for the answer before he gave it. He did not look surprised. He looked certain, and that certainty frightened her more than confusion ever could. "You knew," she said. Not accusation. Not yet. Just the raw shape of the question. Rowan held her gaze. "Not all of it," he said. "But enough to know they have kept you in the dark for a very long time." The chamber stayed silent, but it was a silence full of listening. Elara thought of every lowered glance, every door closed softly in her face, every time she had been made to feel like a mistake that had learned to breathe. And now this ledger lay open before her, offering proof that her life had been arranged by hands far above her own. She should have felt angry. She did feel angry. But beneath it, deeper and more frightening, there was something else. Relief. As if some hidden part of her had been waiting for years to be told she had not been imagining the shape of the cage. Lady Isolde drew a thin breath. "There is more," she said, and when she reached for the next page, even the courtiers leaned in despite themselves. Elara's pulse moved hard beneath her throat. Rowan shifted just enough that if she faltered, she would meet him first. Not the room. Not the record. Him. The page turned. On the parchment below, in the same careful hand, was a line that made the entire chamber seem to hold its breath at once. The line on the parchment did not need to be read twice. The chamber seemed to understand it the moment Elara's eyes found the words, and every breath inside the room turned thin and sharp. Rowan did not move, but she felt the change in him all the same, that quiet alertness settling through his frame like a drawn blade held behind a calm face. Lady Isolde's fingers tightened around the page. "Read it aloud," one of the courtiers muttered, though his voice was not as steady as he wanted it to be. Elara's throat tightened. The words were simple. Too simple for the weight they carried. "By order of the throne," she read, her voice quieter than she intended, the Luna candidate Elara Vale was to be removed from the public line once her bond signature was confirmed. The room did not erupt. It froze. Even the lantern light seemed to stop moving. Elara felt the sentence strike somewhere deep and old inside her, not like a wound, but like proof. Proof that her shame had never been accidental. Proof that the distance, the whispers, the careful exclusions had all been planned long before she had ever learned the shape of the palace halls. Her fingers curled slowly at her side. Around her, the courtiers exchanged startled glances, their certainty collapsing into unease. Someone whispered, "That cannot be right." But the page did not care what they believed. It sat there in black ink, an official seal, calm as truth. Rowan's gaze stayed on her, not on the document. That was what steadied her more than anything. Not the ledger. Not the gasps. Him. He stepped forward just enough to stand beside her shoulder, and his voice was low when he spoke. "Continue." Elara blinked once, then turned the page. Another line. Then another. Each one carried the same cold shape of intention: a meeting arranged without her knowledge, reports altered, invitations delayed, testimony withheld, every path narrowed until she had been made easier to dismiss. The pattern was so deliberate that anger began to rise in her at last, clear and hot beneath the numbness. She had spent years wondering what she had done wrong. The answer was worse than she had imagined. She had done nothing wrong at all. She had simply been useful to people who preferred her silent and small. The realization made her chest ache with a strange, unbearable steadiness. Not because it healed her, but because it gave her something solid to stand on. At the far end of the chamber, Lady Isolde closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself. When she opened them again, she looked older, tired in a way Elara had not noticed before. "There are signatures," she said. "Several. Some are gone from the court. Some are not." A murmur moved through the room. Elara looked at the names, and one in particular caught her eye because it appeared more than once, pressed into the margins with careful insistence. The current Queen's advisor. A man who had smiled at her in hallways. A man who had once told her, kindly enough, that she should be grateful for any place she was given. The memory made her stomach turn. She lifted her chin, though her pulse was beating hard now. "So this was never about whether I was fit," she said. Her voice was stronger on the second half of the sentence. "It was about whether I would disappear quietly." No one answered. That silence was answer enough. Rowan's hand shifted near hers, close but not touching, a presence she could feel like warmth at her side. He did not fill the silence for her. He let her own voice live in it. That was the difference between protection and possession, and Elara felt it with a clarity that almost made her laugh, though there was nothing joyful in it yet. Lady Isolde drew in a slow breath. "There is one final page," she said. Her gaze moved to Elara, then to Rowan, and something unreadable passed across her face. It was sealed separately. The room drew tighter around that sentence. Elara looked at the envelope resting beneath the ledger, its wax seal dark and old. For a moment, she did not want to open it. Not because she feared what was inside, but because she already knew her life would not be the same after she did. Rowan's voice came quietly beside her. "Only if you want to." She turned to him then. In his face she found no pressure, no demand, no hidden instruction. Only patience. Only trust. Her hand moved before doubt could catch it. She broke the seal. The paper inside was folded once, then unfolded carefully with fingers that did not tremble until the final line came into view. And when Elara read it, her breath left her all at once. It was not a dismissal. It was not another order to erase her. It was a notice of inheritance. Her name had been placed in a line no one had spoken aloud, tied to land, authority, and a bloodline older than the throne itself. For one stunned second, Elara could only stare. Then the meaning hit her fully, and the room seemed to tilt around it. This was why they had kept her small. This was why they had watched her so closely. Because someone had known what she was long before she did. Rowan went very still beside her, and when he spoke again, there was something almost reverent in his voice. "Elara," he said softly, as if saying her name differently now would make it more true, "look at the seal." She did. Beneath the signature, beneath the formal language, there was a crest she had never seen before and yet somehow recognized in the ache of her bones. Moon and crown joined together. Not a symbol of obedience. A symbol of return. Elara pressed the paper to her chest, and for the first time in her life, the silence around her did not feel like absence. It felt like the instant before a door opened. The seal rested in Elara's hands like a heartbeat made visible. No one in the chamber spoke. Even the courtiers, so eager only moments ago to turn her life into a spectacle, seemed afraid that sound itself might fracture the truth now standing between them. Rowan's hand remained near hers, not touching, just close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him beside her. It was not possession. It was support, quiet and certain, the kind that asked nothing and offered everything. Elara lifted her chin and read the line again, this time not as a frightened girl waiting to be judged, but as the woman the moon had been shaping all along. The words did not deny what she had been made to believe. They corrected it. By ancient decree, by blood and return, the one who carried the mark of the moon and crown was not a guest in this palace, and not a mistake to be hidden away. She was the rightful queen. The room seemed to draw back from her as the meaning settled in. Lady Isolde's face had gone pale. One of the courtiers lowered his eyes. Another took a step back as if distance could soften shame. Elara felt none of their fear as triumph. What she felt was something deeper, something that had been starved for years and was only now beginning to breathe. Recognition. Not from them. From herself. Rowan turned slightly toward her, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "You do not have to shrink anymore." The sentence landed softly, but it changed everything. Elara looked at him, at the calm strength in his face, at the way he stood beside her as though her truth had always been his to defend, and for a moment she could not remember the last time anyone had spoken to her as if she belonged to her own life. The chamber doors opened wider behind them, carrying in a wash of moonlight that spilled across the floor and reached her bare feet like a quiet blessing. Somewhere beyond the hall, the palace had begun to stir, but here, in this still and listening room, time seemed to pause around her. She understood then that a crown was not only a thing of gold. It was memory. It was burden. It was choice. And for the first time, choice did not terrify her. It steadied her. Elara folded the parchment once and held it against her heart. The silence around her was no longer the silence of being overlooked. It was the silence that comes before people realize they have been looking at the wrong person all along. Rowan's gaze did not leave her face. There was no doubt in it, only a deep and patient certainty, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment since the first time he saw her refuse to bow inside herself. "If you accept this," he said, and there was a gentleness in the words that made her throat tighten, "then the realm will have to accept it too." She inhaled slowly. The moonlight touched the crest on the page, and the seal shimmered faintly in her hands, as if answering her breath. Elara looked once at the chamber, at the people who had tried to define her by silence, by shame, by the size of the shadow they believed she belonged in. Then she looked at Rowan. He did not tell her what to do. He only waited, as if her answer mattered more than the throne, more than the law, more than the watching world beyond the door. And when Elara finally spoke, her voice was clear. "Then let them see me." The words were not loud, but they carried farther than a shout. They moved through the chamber like dawn through locked windows. One by one, heads lifted. The courtiers looked at her differently now, not because they wished to, but because something older than fear had entered the room with her name. Rowan bowed his head, not in submission, but in honor, and when he took her hand this time, it was with the calm reverence of a man standing beside a queen. Together they stepped forward into the moonlit corridor, where the palace no longer seemed like a prison of polished stone but the beginning of a road she had never been allowed to walk until now. And as Elara crossed that threshold, she felt the final piece of her heart settle into place. She had not been ruined by rejection. She had been waiting to return. The corridor beyond the chamber was lined with moonlit glass, and every reflected version of Alara looked steadier than the woman who had entered the palace hours ago. She felt Rowan beside her before she saw him fully, his presence a quiet anchor in the long, polished silence. Ahead, servants lowered their eyes, courtiers stepped back, and the entire palace seemed to remember too late that a woman dismissed in public could still walk out carrying a crown in her future. Alara kept her chin level, though her pulse had not yet learned how to settle. The seal lay warm against her palm, and with every step it felt less like an object and more like a promise being made real. Rowan said nothing at first. He did not need to. His silence was not empty. It was respect, and she was beginning to understand the difference. When they reached the terrace doors, the night air moved over her face like cool silk, carrying the scent of rain from the gardens below. The city beyond the palace shone in quiet layers, thousands of windows lit against the dark, as if the whole kingdom were waiting to see what kind of woman would emerge from the shadows of rejection and walk into her own name. Alara paused at the threshold. For one brief moment, she thought of every room she had been made to shrink inside, every voice that had mistaken her stillness for weakness. None of it followed her here. Not anymore. Are you afraid? Rowan asked softly, not turning to face her. She almost smiled at that. Not because the question was easy, but because he had given it to her without judgment. Alara looked out over the terrace, then down toward the gardens where lanterns swayed in the evening breeze. The world still felt enormous. It still felt dangerous. But it no longer felt closed. Yes, she admitted, and the honesty of it made her breathe easier, not harder. But I am not turning back. Rowan's gaze found hers then, calm and certain. There was something in his expression that made her throat tighten, something older than admiration and gentler than devotion. He had seen the moment she chose herself, and he had not tried to claim it from her. He had only stood near enough to witness it. Behind them, the palace remained hushed, but the hush no longer carried contempt. It carried attention. Expectation. Change. A distant bell sounded somewhere in the lower halls, and one of the couriers hurried past with a folded message pressed to his chest, too frightened to stop. The kingdom was already moving. Alara could feel it in the floor beneath her feet, in the way the air itself seemed to sharpen around the future. Rowan extended his hand, not because she needed it, but because he knew she might want it. She looked at it for only a second before placing her own in his. The contact was simple. Human. Steady. Yet it sent a deep, quiet certainty through her, as if something inside her had been waiting years for this exact kind of kindness, the kind that did not demand surrender in return. Together they descended the steps into the lantern-lit garden, where water moved through narrow stone channels and white flowers opened to the night. Alara felt the eyes of the kingdom upon her even here, though no one dared approach. Let them watch, she thought. Let them remember. She was no longer the woman they had tried to cast aside in a room full of witnesses. She was the woman who walked forward anyway. And as the first notes of a ceremonial hymn drifted through the air from the palace below, Alara understood that this was not the end of a humiliation. It was the beginning of a reign. The first bell of dusk had only just faded when Alara realized the palace was watching her differently. Not with the same polished pity it had used before, not with the same careful distance. Now there was something new in the air, something fragile and almost afraid, as if the people who had dismissed her in public were suddenly unsure where to place their eyes. Rowan noticed it too. He walked beside her through the lantern-lit courtyard with the calm of someone who had already decided that her future would not be negotiated by anyone else. Ahead, the ministers had gathered beneath white stone arches, their robes catching the amber glow from dozens of hanging lamps. Alara could feel the weight of their attention before a single word was spoken. They had come prepared to test her, to measure the shape of her silence, to see whether the woman who had been cast aside would stumble now that the road had opened. But she did not stumble. She kept her shoulders level and her breath even, listening to the fountain water spill softly over marble in the garden below. The sound steadied her more than she expected. It reminded her that not every voice in the kingdom had once been cruel. Some things still flowed forward without asking permission. Rowan paused at the center of the courtyard and turned to her, his expression unreadable in the shifting light. "You do not have to answer them tonight," he said quietly. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it, and somehow that made it gentler. Elara looked past him to the waiting court, to the faces that had once treated her like an inconvenience, and then back to the man who had stood beside her when it mattered. For a moment, she almost laughed at the simple impossibility of it all. One evening, and the entire balance of her life had changed. "I am not afraid of questions," she said. It was true, though the words trembled faintly inside her chest. She was more afraid of being seen clearly than of being judged now. Fear had a different shape when it arrived after survival. Before she could say more, one of the senior ministers stepped forward with a folded ledger in his hands. He bowed, but the movement was stiff, practiced, and not quite respectful. "Your Highness," he began, and then corrected himself with visible effort, "Queen Elara. There are matters of record that must be addressed." The title landed in the courtyard like a dropped glass. Elara felt it ring through her ribs. Queen. The word was still new enough to feel borrowed, as if someone might take it back before dawn. The minister opened the ledger and read from the page, listing matters of land, harvest, border routes, and relief funds as if those were all that mattered. But Elara was listening for the unspoken question beneath his careful tone. Whether she would be decorative or decisive. Whether she would smile and allow stronger voices to continue speaking for her. Whether the kingdom had merely replaced one symbol with another. Rowan answered before she could be forced into that shape. "She will review every petition herself," he said. "And every family displaced by the winter flood will receive aid before the week ends." There was no rise in his voice, no need for threat. Only certainty. Elara turned her head toward him, surprised by the quiet ease with which he made space for her power instead of taking it. The ministers exchanged glances, and in that brief silence, she saw the first crack in their resistance. Not because they had suddenly become kind. Because they had understood that she would not be handled like a token. She stepped forward then, just one measured step, and reached for the ledger. The minister hesitated before releasing it. His fingers lingered on the leather cover for half a second too long, as if the action itself cost him something. Elara accepted it anyway. The pages smelled faintly of ink and dust and old decisions. She opened to the first marked entry and read in silence, her eyes moving steadily over names, numbers, and shortages. There were villages without grain. Bridges that needed repair. Children waiting for medicine. Small burdens. Real ones. The kind that never reached the feast hall until they had already become pain. Her throat tightened, but she did not let it show. This was what power was for. Not to be admired from a distance. To be useful. To be fair. "Begin with the southern roads," she said at last. "If travel is delayed there, every other delivery will fail behind it." The minister blinked. Rowan did not. He only watched her with that same quiet focus, as if he had expected her to know exactly where to place the first piece of the kingdom back into order. The courtyard remained still around them, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of judgment. It was the stillness before a door fully opens. By noon, the palace had settled into a new kind of silence. It was not the brittle silence of courtly mockery anymore, nor the uneasy hush that followed judgment. It was the quieter silence of people beginning to listen. Elara stood beside the long window in the council chamber, the winter light soft on her hands, while Rowan reviewed the final pages of the trade ledger with a steady calm that made the room feel less like a throne room and more like the center of a living kingdom. For the first time, the work in front of her did not seem symbolic. It was practical. Necessary. Real. A steward entered with a stack of reports from the river villages, then another from the eastern farms, then a third from the schoolhouse district where the roof had begun to leak after the last storm. Elara read each page without flinching. She did not pretend the kingdom was whole. She did not dress its problems in ceremony. She only asked the questions that mattered. How many families were affected? Which road was slowest? Which granary was closest? Which healers could reach the children before dusk? The ministers, who had once assumed she would only sit quietly and wear the crown, exchanged looks that carried equal parts surprise and relief. There was no vanity in her attention. No hunger for praise. She simply wanted the realm to work. That, more than any speech, changed the air around her. By the time she set the papers aside, 3 separate decisions had already been made, and every one of them had come from her. Rowan signed the last order and slid it toward her without a word. His restraint would have felt cold in another man, but from him it felt like trust made visible. Elara looked at the seal drying in red wax and understood, with a strange steadiness, that authority did not need to shout to be real. It only needed to serve well. Outside the chamber, the corridor had begun to fill with attendants, messengers, and guards who no longer moved around her as if she were made of glass. They moved with awareness. With care. Some bowed. Some simply stepped aside with lowered eyes. It was not worship. It was respect, and that mattered more. Elara walked through it all with her back straight and her pulse calm. The palace no longer felt like a place built to remind her of what she had lost. It felt like a place asking her what she would build in return. In the afternoon, Rowan led her to the upper gallery above the east gardens, where the kingdom could be seen spreading out beneath them in stone rooftops, winding roads, and far fields bright under the pale sun. He placed a single folded map into her hand. Not ceremonial. Not decorative. A working map marked with flood channels, supply routes, and the old boundary lines that had been neglected for years. These roads need to be restored before spring planting, he said quietly. And the northern villages need grain before the thaw. Elara studied the markings, and for the first time since the rejection that had once shattered her life into pieces, she felt none of the old ache. Only purpose. She traced the routes with her fingertip and nodded. Then we begin there, she said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a promise. Below them, the garden paths stretched in silver light, and the wind moved through the bare branches like a voice remembering something sacred. Rowan turned to her then, his expression unreadable for a long moment, before something gentle crossed his face. Not pity. Not possession. Recognition. He saw the woman who had survived being cast aside and still found a way to stand with dignity. He saw the queen who did not need to prove she was powerful because her choices already spoke for her. Elara looked out across the kingdom and felt the last of the old loneliness loosen inside her. The wound was not the end of her story. It had been the passage that led her here. And now, with winter giving way and the first signs of spring waiting beyond the hills, she could feel the future moving toward her at last, quiet and certain as dawn. The last snow of the season had melted by morning, leaving the palace gardens washed in silver light and the air soft with the promise of spring. Elara stood at the highest terrace, her cloak resting lightly over her shoulders, and looked out across the kingdom she had once only been allowed to serve from the shadows. Now, the same gates that had once closed against her opened before her without hesitation. The same voices that had once whispered over her head now fell quiet when she entered, not from fear, but from respect. It still felt unreal in the quietest part of her heart, as if some fragile part of her might wake and find it had all been a dream. But then she heard the steady rhythm of footsteps behind her, familiar and unhurried, and she knew it was real. Rowan came to stand beside her without a word. He did not crowd her, did not try to fill the silence with promises she had not asked for. He only looked out at the land with her, as if he understood that some moments were too sacred to be broken by too many words. Below them, workers moved through the courtyard restoring the old fountains, and children from the lower streets were being welcomed into the palace gardens for the first time. The kingdom was changing in small, honest ways. Not all at once. Not with spectacle. But with care. That was what made it beautiful. Elara let the morning sun touch her face and felt something inside her finally settle. For so long, she had measured her worth by the pain others gave her. She had stood beneath judgment and learned to shrink, to endure, to survive being overlooked. But now, standing here, she could feel a different truth taking root. She had not become powerful because someone finally chose her. She had become powerful because she had never stopped being kind when kindness was the harder choice. She had never stopped standing when the world wanted her bowed. She had never stopped listening to the quiet needs of others, even when no one had listened to hers. Rowan turned to her then, his expression warm in the pale light. "You changed everything," he said softly. Elara's breath caught at the simplicity of it. He meant the kingdom, yes. The court. The laws. The old cruelty that had been allowed to harden into custom. But he meant more than that, and they both knew it. She had changed the shape of the future simply by refusing to disappear. Her throat tightened, not with grief this time, but with the tenderness of being seen exactly as she was. "No," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "We did." His gaze deepened, and for a moment the air between them held the warmth of all they had survived. No grand declaration was needed. No ceremonial vow. The truth was already standing there between them, solid and gentle as stone laid for a home. Together, they had built something stronger than a crown. They had built trust. They had built a place where the broken were no longer hidden away. They had built a kingdom that would remember mercy. The bells from the lower square began to ring, one by one, carrying through the morning like a blessing. Elara smiled as she heard them. It was not the smile of a woman who had been rescued. It was the smile of a woman who had come back to herself. Rowan reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation. His thumb brushed once over her knuckles, a quiet gesture, almost tender enough to be mistaken for a dream. But it was not a dream. It was a beginning, made from all the endings that had failed to destroy her. Far below, the first flowers of spring had opened in the palace gardens, pale and fearless against the thawing ground. Elara watched them sway in the morning breeze and felt something in her chest open with them. She had been rejected, doubted, and set aside. She had walked through the kind of loneliness that could hollow a person out. Yet here she stood, whole in the only way that truly mattered. Not because life had been easy. Not because the past had vanished. But because she had carried her own light through the dark and found, at last, a place where it was welcomed. And as the sun climbed higher over the kingdom, Elara leaned into the day with quiet certainty, knowing that what had been broken had not been lost. It had been remade. It had been honored. It had been returned to the light.